Okay, so today is Wednesday. It's the 16th of Kislev. Less than 10 days until Hanukkah begins. Uh, already, I want to dedicate this shiur to the memory of Rahmat Aziz. Um, أشرائي شيرا دناي بن زتاق حسب أول الشريط درح القديم تورا دناي توب شمن توب يوم ما بين يمردو علم ما يرحميم هو ما رحمة بالريم النفس روح نشما شال نفتار بشم توب من هؤلاء وروح عزيز بن أبراهام روح على خنا بيكون عدل هملك رحمة ويرحم الله. So last week we were starting the discussion of the Kuzari with the Christian scholar. I'm not sure if he's a priest or what is he. He doesn't really tell
It's
us.
a Christian scholastic in this book.
So calls upon the Christian scholar. I think yes. Let me pull up the screen here. Share it with everybody so everyone can see. Let's see where is. Huh. Give me a second here. That's not it. Here we go. Sure. So last week, I believe we did cover this right here, where it talks about the creation being created yesh me'ayin, meaning that it was created from nothing, that it was created in 6 days, and that there was Adam and Noah, and all humanity traces their lineage back to these people. He then says, I think, yes, we left off, actually, I think, talking about that God speaks and appears on different levels to prophets and other saintly persons. And he dwells among them, among a chosen nation of people. So last week, I believe we were getting to the discussion of this phrasing, chosen nation of people, that's where God dwells. And that I was insinuating that he's using a vague language in order to convey an idea that it's no longer really necessarily the Jewish people who are this chosen group of people, that it's now the Christians. He doesn't say it outright yet, but he will get to that point. And we were discussing this as being the replacement theology that's part of the original Christian doctrine. Okay. The next paragraph, he begins here, paragraph 6. This is essentially, I believe all that is written in the Torah and in the sacred books of the Jews. And I believe what he means by that, by the other sacred books, is the rest of what we would call the Mikra or the Tanakh, the Ketubim, the Nevi'im, those being the sacred books as well, but not the Gemara. I wouldn't say. There can be no doubt as to their veracity. The miracles recorded therein were shown to all nations of the world. The miracles endured for extended periods, and revelations were made apparent to the masses and not just to individuals. This argument right here is actually is part of the argument of how do we know Judaism is a quote unquote true religion. Because with other religions, the argument usually is it's one person who God reveals himself to, and we have to take that word of that person who tells us that he or she spoke to God. Usually he. I don't think there is a religion that was started by a she that's a major religion in the Western world, or the Eastern world for that matter. In any event, you have Muhammad who tells us, I heard God's voice. And you have Jesus who says, I was transfigured by Moshe and the prophet Elijah into the Messiah. But with the Christian is now stating this. The Christian is saying that what makes the Jewish people different and what makes the Torah an important part of the Christian religion is that the Torah was a mass revelation, meaning that we're not taking each other's word for it. We were all there in theory. And since we were all there, we all know the story is true. That's kind of the logic behind his statement here.
Here's where it veers.
What's that?
this next paragraph is where it veers off track.
Yes. I was wondering if there was anything worth else. It's very interesting about this paragraph, the sixth paragraph here about the veracity. There's no doubt to the veracity of the Bible, and when he says, he's talking about, of course, our Tanakh, what they call the Old Testament. It's interesting because later, much later from here, it was Christian theologians who actually originated the critical biblical school. In other words, trying to pick apart the Old Testament and dividing it into different authorship in order to remove authority from the Old Testament, from our Bible. But here, that's not a concern yet. Okay, next paragraph. During the period at the end of the Jewish nation's history, which is a very interesting way of perspective, I would say, divinity took physical form. This form first materialized as a fetus in the womb of a virgin. And here he does use the Hebrew word for virgin, betula, but I'm not sure if everyone knows there is a very famous prophecy in the book of Isaiah that Isaiah gives. It's very early on in the book, where he says, "Behold, this woman will have a child. She'll bear a child, and she'll name him Emmanuel." And the word they use for woman is Alma. Alma was mistranslated either by accident or maliciously on purpose to mean a virgin, although Alma really means a young woman. Usually a young woman and a virgin are one and the same thing, so maybe that's what they thought, but really it just means a young woman, her first child, basically, like she's just a young lady. And this prophecy wasn't a prophecy for the future. This was a prophecy that was already fulfilled in the next chapter of Isaiah. And it's the woman that's being talked about is most likely Isaiah's own wife. And Isaiah is giving a sign to the king saying, look, you want a sign that you're going to win this war? This young woman is going to have a child, and we're going to name that child Emmanuel, meaning God is with us. It's like the prophets like to use dramatic metaphor in real life to present God's ideas sometimes. But that whole prophecy really got caught up with Christian notions. A lot of Isaiah, truth be told, got caught up with Christian notions and were distorted here. And this is one of the distortions, being that it was a betula, a virgin. According to the Christian story, it was a betula. There is no doubt in the story in the New Testament whether Mary was a virgin or not. The story is very clear she was a virgin, but it has no basis in Jewish prophecy. That's a new innovation, Greek innovation, I would say. Okay, so materializing the fetus of a virgin. She was from a family of Jewish royalty, and she later gave birth to this entity. This child was visibly human, but secretly divine, visibly a prophet who had been sent, but secretly the sent God. He is the Messiah, also known as the Son of God. He is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. We attribute unity to his true essence, despite the fact that our terminology defines him as a Trinity. So here is where we, like as Mark said, we're introduced to purely Christian thought and belief right at this point. And the Christian is introducing their theological innovations and what makes them different than Judaism. But we can see in the Christians, in the paragraph here, we can see his biases. The first thing being that the Jewish nation history came to an end. There's no longer a Jewish nation. And this is the very beginning of the inkling of his introduction of the replacement theology that we'll be seeing coming up in the next few paragraphs. After that, we have the idea of divinity taking a physical form. We are very clear in the Mishneh Torah when we went over that last time, or last 2 years. I don't know how long it was ago now. It was a while ago when we first started, because it was at the very beginning of the Mishneh Torah, that in no way, shape, or form does God have a body. Can he be a body? And it's not a limitation on God. It's it's the idea that God is part of the universe and can interact with the universe is a Christian idea. Whereas the Jewish perspective, and it could have changed, there could be different nuances on this, but the classical Jewish perspective, as presented in the Talmud, is that God is a separate entity from the universe, just like a baker and its cake. When the baker creates a cake, the baker isn't part of the cake, hopefully, ideally, otherwise don't eat at that bakery anymore. But when the baker makes a cake, he is separate from that cake entirely, but he knows that cake. He created that cake. That's a very crude analogy I can give for the God's relationship to our universe. The idea that the baker could then come down into the cake and then masquerade as a member of the cake is where his logic and our logic don't mix, because of how we view God differently. Our visions of God are different. And the Christian notion could have really just come from the pagan notion of pantheism, of God is in everything. God is in this lamp, God is in that tree. So therefore, God can be in this person as well, and he can avatar himself into our world. Now, there are emanations of God in our world. We usually call them angels. They're messengers. And it's very interesting that in the Hebrew, what he uses, he says, Navi Shaluch Benira, he is the prophet that was sent. Ve Eloha Shaluach Benistar, the God that was sent in hiding, which, could maybe work with the idea of a malach or anything like that. I'm not here to really understand it, just to present that where our theology differs a little bit. And I'm not actually very uncomfortable using the word our theology as Jews, because this is also a Western notion that we have kind of needed to adapt in order to explain ourselves in Western language. There really isn't a theology in Judaism. It's a there is a theological component for sure, but it's very much it doesn't work with it doesn't fall into the patterns of other religions. All right. Any comments, questions, concerns?
I didn't understand your last sentence.
Gotcha. Judaism, in its essence, became a religion very recently. A religion where people want to say that we have a dogma, like the 13 principles are our dogma, and our theological inklings are monotheistic, and we have a certain cult. That's all true. But these are words and terms that we're really borrowing. Oh, good morning. Good morning. That we're really borrowing in order to explain in Western language and Western thought what Judaism is. But those ideas and those words don't exactly capture what the essence and an explanation of Judaism. The Hachamim of classical era, not so classical era, of up until the modern era, didn't really deal with theological issues. Theological issues are very much based in imaginative and abstract thinking. Not that there's anything wrong with imaginative and abstract thinking. It's a necessary part of life, and people have to have abstract thought from time to time. But it's nothing that you can really come to a conclusion on without revelation. The baker has to reveal themselves. The cake can never conceive of the baker. It's outside of its existence and its thought process altogether. The only reason we have some sort of connection with God is because of the revelations that God had made to his prophets, to his two people. One of the things about Abraham Avinu that we discussed a few weeks ago was that Abraham Avinu didn't hear God's voice until he was in his 70s. 75, I believe. And he and he conceived and thought and meditated on what is God in the world, what is the nature of God. And only when he got to be very distant from his pagan roots that's when God revealed himself to Abraham Avinu and created a covenant with him. And that's the basis of Abraham's relationship with God. That's when he was able to conceive of him being the only God, the true God, all of that. And the same with us standing at Mount Sinai. It wasn't just that Moses heard God's voice and said, oh, he says, I am who I am, and he came and he sent me to you to free you. He brought us all to Mount Sinai where we all had a revelation of God. And we now have an intuitive relationship with God. And it's not based off of a philosophical understanding. Now, there's a work called Chovot HaLevavot, which is translated as the duties of the heart, and better translated as the commandments or the mitzvot, or the obligations of the heart. And in that book, the Aham Bachya Ibn Pekuda, he elaborates on that just because we have this revelatory knowledge of God does not excuse us from thinking about what does that mean? What is God? What is the unity of God? And trying to understand that still. But it's a mitzvah. It's part of our relationship with God. But it's not what predicates our relationship with God. What predicates our relationship with God is not our understanding of him or our knowledge of him, which can never be complete or true. What predicates our relationship with God is the covenant that he has created with us at Mount Sinai with our forefathers, and going all the way back even to Adam Harishon, the first human being. They each created covenants and pacts with each other. And it shows that it's not so much about the philosophy and theology behind our relationship, which is important. We think about it, but it's not what predicates that relationship. Does that help answer? Does it make more sense?
It's interesting, and I'd like to pursue it, but I don't know if you want to do it now.
Okay.
Because I don't see a distinction.
Okay. Can you explain why there's no distinction?
Our revelation at Sinai is by the year 2021 with you and me is abstract and philosophical.
Gotcha.
Now, granted, my soul was there, but in the nuts and bolts, I don't see a distinction.
Good point. For us, it's not something we directly experienced. It seems that, and I think he gets into this with the Chaver, and Rambam talks about this as well. It's that, and I don't think it was really understood until recently with the concept of epigenetic trauma. The problem with this explanation is that it makes it solely an experiential that's passed on through DNA and not through conversion. So I don't have a good answer for that. But the answer that I think is usually, excuse me 1 second. Okay, give me a second, okay? Thank you. Sorry, where was I? Oh yes, that the experience at Har Sinai, at Mount Sinai, where it says that, I am making this covenant not only with you who are here today, but also with those who are not here today. That binding of the covenant is legally binding. But also, aside from the legality, forget the legality, that the trauma of hearing God's voice, of standing at Mount Sinai, that was kind of imprinted into our genetic makeup and is then passed on parent to child intuitively, naturally. The problem is that, like, okay, what about converts? What about that's basically the only example that would work in. But How about people who have left Judaism and then come back to Judaism, like the Anusim, and they mix in? And what about people? There's all kinds of things like that. And Harambam doesn't really have that. Could have worked in the Middle Ages. I don't know if it works 100% now. And there's even the idea that, like, Harambam said that a person who doubts the revelation, you should doubt whether or not they're Jewish. Like it should be so obvious to them. As far as like what about the binding, like that, I don't think that that's so much of a problem. We weren't at the signing of the Constitution, but we're still legally bound to American law by dint of being citizens of the American nation. The same thing with Judaism. We weren't at Mount Sinai physically, but we're still bound by being part of the nation. But as far as that being like obvious to us, that's a good point. I don't have a great response to that. So that's a very good point. Yoram, I see your hands up.
Yeah, first, I apologize. I listened to Israel. They talked about how the Israeli Air Force was bombing the headquarters of Syrian army in Damascus in the Yom Kippur War. This is like James Bond or better. But anyway, two questions here. One, there were non-Jews in Mount Sinai, the Erev Rav. Not only Jews left Egypt, and to the best of my knowledge, they didn't have conversion according to halacha or Jewish law. So, but they were present. And let's say their ancestors or their grandchildren converted to Judaism. So their soul was there, though they were not Jewish.
There was no Jewish law before Mount Sinai. So converting to Jewish law, according to Jewish law, there's no concern of converting to Jewish law before Mount Sinai.
Yeah, but if they were non-Jews, they didn't become automatically Jewish, the Erev Rav, by just showing up in Sinai.
I think they
many
did.
people, they got converted.
There was no conversion. There was no Jewish law. They were just part of the Berit.
Okay.
Like, who did Abraham Avinu's conversion when he converted from Ur Kasdim to Israelite? Who was on his Beit Din? Who was? There wasn't any Jewish law. There wasn't a Beit Din. These were all things that came by consequence of there being Jewish law. But when you're standing at Har Sinai, that is the genesis of our people, of our nation, I should say. And it's not only this children of Yaakov, but like you said, the mixed multitude, the Erev Rav, who was also there as well. That allowed them to be part of the people. Now, there's a whole Kabbalistic bias against the Erev Rav, and a lot of people say that it's the Erev Rav solely who's responsible for all of the sins in the Midbar. But yeah, it's the whole people all together. The whole reason for making Erev Rav, that there's Kabbalistic inyanim behind that, which is complicated to get into. But yeah, they became part of the Jewish people 100%. And you have other people who were always welcomed in, such as Rahab, who was Yehoshua's wife, who was the woman who lived in the wall. And you have Ruel, Yithro. According to some opinions, some people say not so much, that they didn't convert. Tipora, for sure, 100%. And it wasn't about them converting or going through a process. It was about really acceptance of being a part of the peoplehood.
What about circumcision? Abraham circumcised himself and his children.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if massive circumcision took place in the desert, and I'll be shocked if they were circumcised in Egypt before
There was no circumcision in the desert. In fact, one of the prerequisites of entering the land is that there had to be a mass circumcision. And because they were going to celebrate the Pesach, in order to bring the Pesach, you cannot have an orla. You have to be circumcised. So they all went through that process as they were entering the land, but not in the desert. And I don't know why they didn't do it in the desert. Safety reasons, I'm not sure, but good
they
point.
were concerned of COVID in the desert.
Possibly. COVID Rosh. So, all right. Let's continue on with our paragraph here. With
Back to the Trinity.
Back to the Trinity. The Trinity, the famous Trinity. Now, the Trinity, it's very interesting. we say that Jews are not corrupted by the Trinity, but in Catalonia, in northern Spain, around the time of the Maimonidean controversy, during the times of the Rishba, I'm not sure when that was, there was a Jewish Trinity. I won't get into it now. Maybe I'll send an article or I'll post an article in the on the website about it, or some snit, or I'll bring some footnotes for it next time. But it's not so distant from us. Tamir, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to just sort of capsulize what your point was. It seems that the point that you were making originally was that that Judaism differs from other religions, and the other religions tend to take a philosophical bent and accept those points on faith, whereas our relationship with the divine is contractual and experiential and contractual.
Yes.
And at least historically, you're saying it's not based on philosophy, it's or faith. It's based upon acceptance of a contract.
Very, very good synopsis. That is exactly correct.
Right.
According to the opinion of the Kuzari and other people of his theological, philosophical ideology.
Okay. Then you're making the point that later on, in the modern period, we became, maybe by influenced by modern thought and the Enlightenment and stuff, is we grafted on philosophical viewpoints,
Yeah.
and interpretations onto our own tradition.
Yes. And it seems that it's a consequence really of the Enlightenment era. Even during the Christian era, the medieval period, there wasn't so much of a philosophical, even though a lot of people see it as the golden age of Jewish philosophy. You have the Chovas Levavot, the Kuzari, you have the Guide for the Perplexed, and other quote unquote philosophical works. But really, it wasn't until the Enlightenment period when Judaism had to not combat other religions anymore, but had to combat atheism and just not being Jewish anymore, and presenting ourselves as an enlightened, connected people with a thought process. But there's a really good essay on that about modernization, and its central figure they follow in it is Rabbi Israel Moshe Hazan, who was from Smyrna, but I believe he lived in Italy during the 19th century. And his response and how he would use philosophy and other things to repackage, I don't like that word either very much, represent Judaism in a more quote unquote enlightened way, but didn't really change any of the thoughts or any of the essence or the behind it.
Tamir,
Yes.
what did you contrast contractual with?
With faith and philosophy and faith, the acceptance of philosophical points on faith, which you can see certainly in Christianity and Islam, and maybe to a lesser extent.
And historically, that wasn't true with Judaism, but for today's contemporary Jews,
it has become more normative, because we think
we're accepting the contract.
The Jews of ancient times, or Jews of classical times, were viewed Judaism more as a system and a contractual system, and an acceptance of what God wanted from us, but not a philosophical underpinning of the nature of God. That came later, or developed later from the Middle Ages onward, and really became to the forefront in modern times when we take a philosophical attitude towards religion. Whereas Christians, from the very get-go, everything was built on faith, the acceptance of Jesus as God, and the good and evil and sin and salvation. All that philosophical underpinning was much more important than their trappings, their rules. They don't even have very many rules. They've got a few. They've got traditions and holidays and stuff, but It's not nowhere. It's nowhere. It's nothing the same as the system of halakha and mitzvot and a prescribed way of life, which is what Judaism was built on, and still is built on. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm like a third of the way of understanding what you're saying. That's pretty good.
I'm trying to I'm pulling out, I'm trying to flesh out what Yosef has said,
Yeah.
which is really important, I think, when we contrast the religions against each other and say what is unique to Judaism.
But it's still it still has accepting the yoke.
Yes,
The
there's still an
Chabad term.
acceptance, but in Judaism, it's more like it's an acceptance of what's expected of you, what you do. It's not an acceptance of what you believe or what you philosophize about.
Even total rejection of halakha doesn't negate a Jewish person's identity, which is not the norm of that's not the norm of any religion. Any Christian who just says, no, I don't think the whole Jesus thing makes sense, they're no longer a Christian.
Yeah, that's true. Christians would not consider them Christian.
Yeah, Christians.
Or somebody who's not irreligious or non-practicing would still be considered a Jew.
Yes, absolutely, 100%.
For 80.
Eleanor, see, you go ahead, Eleanor. I saw your hand up, and then you're on. Go ahead, Eleanor.
I believe that Jesus did not say himself that he was the Son of God or come up with the Trinity. I believe it was his followers who did that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering why. What was the impetus to come up with the Trinity?
It's a very, very good question, but I don't think I can appropriately answer it in a quick question. But it has to do. I think, in my opinion, it has to do with the introducing it's synthesizing different cultures in order to present a more palatable religion. David, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, Mark, it's sort of simple for me in the sense that we are ethnically, biologically, organically Jewish, regardless of all the rest of the stuff. As you said, is that a Jew can reject all of halakha and still be Jewish. The only way to get to Islam and to get to Christianity is to go through Christ. If that's not part of your of what you're doing, then you're not a Christian. That's the only way to be a Christian. And there's more of a, I don't want to say duality, but there's more of a division here in Judaism. And I would think of it as, in the modern terms, thinking about yourself as ethnically Jewish. I think that's the easiest concept to go through this. Please, Yosef, tell me.
No, that's actually pretty good. Like with this whole, like what Eleanor brought up with the idea of the Trinity, that's a religious doctrine that must be accepted in order to be considered a good Christian.
Exactly.
A Jew can be like, you know what, I don't accept the decrees of the rabbis. It doesn't lessen their status as a Jew. A Christian could then be considered, the Christian will no longer receive communion. They would be cut off from the church. That's the way Christians use the term excommunication. They're not in communion with God by rejecting certain doctrines or principles. Whereas a Jew, they still have, quote unquote, communion with God, despite what they do or believe.
Because we were at Sinai,
yeah.
And it's even harder for the Catholics because they have transubstantiation and they need a priest.
Mm-hmm.
So they built up a number of different walls to getting your ticket and get through the door. I think what you're saying is that because we were all Sinai, that's not us. We don't have to play those games.
Right. We have what's called in medieval parlance, it's called an experiential or an intuitive knowledge of God.
Does that help at all, Mark?
Again, it's helping. Yeah.
We'll get there. Don't worry. It's not an easy concept. And this is most of the bulk of what the Kuzari is going to be discussing and addressing. Yoram?
Well, David said that being Jewish is part of the DNA. We talked in a conversion class, I forgot which one, that the Christians convert to Judaism, then he changes his mind and become a Muslim. So his DNA is not Jewish, and I couldn't remember why he didn't lose his Jewishness. So he's Christian, Jew, Muslim. They have three religions. I don't know if you lose your Christianity when you convert to another religion, but you don't lose your Judaism, even if you didn't start as Jewish and you are not ending as Jewish from a practice by the conversion, as if your DNA was altered.
Yes. So, yeah, it has to do like a Christian, once they convert to another religion, they're no longer Christian. A Jew, when they convert to another religion, now this isn't so much, so this here isn't so much a religious principle, but I think more of a political principle. They're no longer, what do you call it? Available for much of the polis of Judaism. Like you can't appoint like Cardinal Ratzinger, I think is, I'm not sure if he's alive anymore. I think he might have passed away, but he was Jewish. He was converted to Catholicism after the war and raised as a Catholic. Or truth be told, I'm not sure if I know his whole story 100%. I could be wrong, but I knew that there was a Cardinal Ratzinger who was Jewish, right? And he was a Catholic cardinal. You wouldn't appoint him as like the Shliach Tzibor in a minyan. He wouldn't be fit for being the minyan leader. But, or as a witness, you wouldn't have him be a witness at a wedding or something like that. But he would, if he put on tefillin, it would still be considered a mitzvah if he did it with the right intentions.
Would he be the 10th? Could he be the 10th person at a minyan? So you could say Kiddush, Kaddish?
I think halachically no, but
Okay.
a lot of things today
Yeah.
are not halachically. You're not allowed to give a person I'll tell you this story. I was at a minyan once, and it's an Orthodox synagogue, and someone who drove there got an aliyah. Right, the rabbi gave them an aliyah, and there was a visitor there who stormed out of the synagogue because the rabbi gave the person who drove to the synagogue an aliyah. And he called him afterwards, not on Shabbat obviously, but he called him afterwards and complained about how dare you? I thought this was an Orthodox synagogue. How you giving people who are breaking Shabbat honors in the synagogue? This is not halakha. The rabbi just didn't have time for him. But like this is he's technically right. Technically he's right. That according to halakha, according to Jewish law, a person who is mechalel Shabbat b'farhesia, they are basically an apostate from Judaism. But the halakha isn't talking about somebody who's driving to synagogue on Shabbat. Like there's something different about being still involved in Judaism. A person who used to be mechalel Shabbat b'farhesia, publicly desecrating Shabbat, that was their declaration of, I am no longer a member of the Jewish people. I reject Torah entirely. And this is where the whole tension in the Orthodox world came from in the beginning of the modern period. Of you have this new idea of a secular Jew that was never around before. But the Jewish person still identifies as a Jew. I'm not putting my loyalties anywhere else. My loyalties still lie with the Jewish people. I'm not the most observant, or you could say law-abiding citizen of the nation, but I'm still an American. I'm still a Jew at the end of the day. So that's that dichotomy and tension there. Carol?
I was just going to ask about the Haredi, if because they reject, I thought, people who are not practicing like to the extent that they do. Am I wrong? I don't.
No, you're correct to a degree. With a broad brush, yes. If you ever, not that you should ever go, but if you ever found yourself in Mea Sharim, you can see that there's a lot of judgment.
There.
Rahman Hatzlan, I'm glad you survived because I have trouble with it. It's not a friendly place, and it's not. I'm not saying it as like it's a stain on religious Judaism because Mea Sharim is in the center of Jerusalem. It's densely populated, And everyone who lives outside of Minsharim has a negative view of Minsharim. Not to say that I've never had a positive experience in Minsharim, or I don't know people who live in Minsharim who are nice. Of course I do. But the general consensus, the general feeling is that you avoid that neighborhood on Shabbat. Don't go into that area if you're not dressed according to their standards. Like it's not a good siman. It's not a good sign for Jews. That being, and
They were
there, uh-huh.
They were nice to me. I was shopping, trying on clothes for my daughter.
Good,
They
good.
were, I don't know on, but they were nice to me
Good,
when I
good. Absolutely. I'm
shopped.
glad to hear that. But the Haredi mindset is coming from what I have a friend of mine, I love it. He calls it being a Karaite of the oral law, or a Karaite of the Shulchan Aruch. Whatever it says in the Shulchan Aruch, that's the truth, and there's no nuance, there's no development. That we have to read the Shulchan Aruch like a person who thinks. Just like we read the Torah and every other piece of literature that we have in front of us as a person who thinks, we have to read our legal codes the same way as people who think, and not be blindly bound to letters on a page, but to bring the letters off of the page and interpret them correctly. That's the whole point. But a lot of people miss that in the nuance today. All right. So getting back to the Trinity with the few minutes we have left, I mentioned that there was people who say, that the Christians have a what do you call it? A plus to them over the Kabbalists, because the Christians only added 2 gods to our Unitarian system, but the Kabbalists added 9 because they have 10 Sephiroth and they have 10 different gods that they pray to. While the Christians, at least, they only have 3. But it's not a very nuanced understanding of what the Sephiroth are in the Kabbalah. But the idea here being that there are times in Judaism, and there are times, especially in Kabbalistic and in northern Spain and France, where there was a really interesting interpretation of what is God and how he interacts with the world. And I would say it was definitely in response to the idea of the Christian Trinity. But the idea of the Christian Trinity is very simple. It's a candle. Just as the candle is the flame and the wick and the wax, and they're all really one thing, so is God. The analogy isn't perfect, though. I mean, it works for Christians. I don't think it works in reality, though, because the wax and the flame and the wick, they are very separate things that are just slapped together. So the same thing here with the Trinity. It's a introduction, as Eleanor was asking earlier, it's an introduction of pagan thought into Jewish thought in order to kind of meld cultures and be more palatable to pagan religions. It's very interesting. He mentions here Ruach HaKodesh as being part of the Trinity. He says, V'nikra ben Elohim, that he is the Son of God, meaning Jesus is. V'hu ha'av, v'hu ha'ben, v'hu ha'ruach HaKodesh, that he is the Father, the Son, and the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, the Holy Ghost. This is a misunderstanding of what Ruach HaKodesh is. Ruach HaKodesh here is considered to be some sort of entity that then whispers nice things into people's ears. And we hear this a lot of the time, sometimes in Jewish parlance also, that a certain book was written with the help of the Ruach HaKodesh. The Ruach HaKodesh came to them and told them how to write the book. That it's like a step below prophecy. This is, I think, a Christian understanding of what the Ruach HaKodesh is. I think in the Jewish understanding of what the Ruach HaKodesh is a state of mind that a person becomes acculturated to by going to the Mikdash, by going to the Kodesh. It's Ruach HaKodesh, not Ruach Kedusha. Ruach Kedusha would be Holy Spirit. Ruach HaKodesh is the spirit of the Kodesh, the spirit you encounter by din of being around something that is very holy. Originally, for us, that was the temple. When you go to the temple, you have a spiritual experience because of its architecture and the smells and the sounds, kind of similar to if you go to an Indian drum circle, there's the pounding of the drum and it gets you into a different headspace, something like that. We also had that with the singing of the Levites, the burning of the incense, all kinds of stuff. The going to the temple was a very experiential immersive meditation. And it was supposed to trigger in us a memory, the national memory of standing at Mount Sinai. And that would trigger the Ruach, that would what was called the Ruach HaKodesh. Now, after the destruction of the temple, and after we were scattered, that was no longer an option for us. So the rabbis needed to do something. And this is where Jewish mysticism finds its origins. Jewish mysticism finds its origins in this movement where the rabbis then repackage the temple, repackage rituals, and create what we call today Judaism for after the fall of the Second Temple. And they introduce mystical elements to us in order to help us still connect to the Kodesh, even though it's no longer there. And we see this story in the famous story of Rabbi Akiva and the Pardes, where Rabbi Akiva and 3 of his students enter the Pardes, and they all go through something not so good. Ben Azai goes insane. Aher becomes an apostate. Only Rabbi Akiva enters in peace and leaves in peace. This story we find in the 2nd chapter of Hagigah in the Gemara, but we also find it in the Tosefet, which is a collection of works that was rejected from the Mishnah, but it's still authoritative in a sense. And this is a mystical experience that's packaged into our oral tradition. And today, when someone says something was written, Beruach HaKodesh, it doesn't mean that somebody, that a ghost came to somebody and whispered into their ear that God has some sort of, go ask Kima, please. Or just give me 5 minutes. Okay, good. Or less than that even. That when someone says someone's written in the Ruach HaKodesh, it means that they were interacting with the mitzvot and Judaism in a certain way that got them to a certain frame of mind, and then they were able to write some sort of poetry or write some sort of song or something like that. And that's what we mean today by Ruach HaKodesh. But when the Christians say Ruach HaKodesh, they literally mean some sort of holy spirit, a spirit that's part of God, that is kind of like the muse in Greek literature or Greek culture. And we see that was then co-opted and became part of the Trinity. And now that's part of what God is. Rather than a state of mind, it's an integral part of God in Christian thought. But it's one unity. I'm not sure how that whole works, but there's a lot of play on words. And in fact, some say that because of the Trinity, Judaism had to change some of its things. Like originally, some people say that there were 3 cups of wine at the Pesach Seder, but we had to make it 4 in order to distance ourselves from the Trinity, and things like that. I don't know if that's totally true, but even today in messianic circles, Christians who are costume playing as Jews, they have messianic Haggadot, messianic Pesach Seders, and they say that there's the 3 matzot. It represents the Trinity, and that the broken matzah represents the broken body of Jesus. So we see that a lot of our customs are even still being infiltrated and imbued with new meaning and new symbolism, new iconography, even today, even though we're thousands of years after the fact. So we'll end here today. Are there any thoughts, questions, concerns? Tov.
Really good. Thanks.
Good. I hope, and don't worry. We're going to definitely be revisiting this idea of a non-philosophical, non-theological understanding of God in Judaism as opposed to other religions, and we'll see that as it unfolds in the rest of the weeks here. So, everybody have a good day. We'll see you all. There's a lunch and learn today at 12, and then there's of course. What do we call it? Arvit, Marv at 6:45. So we'll see you all there, and everyone have a good.
Thank you.